All right, good afternoon. I am just here to discuss Shakespeare in the Bush. It is basically about an anthropologist who goes to live with the tea people in West Africa. She thinks she can prove that Shakespeare's stories are all universal, so she decides to tell them the plot of Hamlet. But as she goes through the story, the Teve interpreting everything through their own beliefs and meaning, so it changes everything. The way that they interpret it is completely different than what her intentions were. By the end, she realizes that what she thought the story was is actually tied to her own cultural background. So, this article really shows how worldviews shape the way people interpret cultural meanings. The Teve elders don't see ghosts, marriage, revenge, any of those things the same way that the anthropologist does. So they reshape the story to fit what they believe about how the world works. It's a reminder that people don't just hear a story; they're going to filter it through their own experiences, their own worldview. One clear bias in the article is the author assuming that her interpretation of Shakespeare is the correct one. She goes in thinking that the Teve will understand Hamlet the same way that she does, and that Western audiences do. The assumption comes straight from her worldview. She grew up in a culture that treats Shakespeare like the gold standard. When the Teve challenge her interpretation, she realizes that she was actually the one that was making the assumptions. The story challenges the idea that our own cultural values are normal or best. The Teve weren't confused; they just applied their own logic to the way that they interpreted it. What felt like it was very obvious to the anthropologist wasn't obvious to them, and vice versa. It shows that what we think is common sense is actually just what we are familiar with. A good example from my own life is the norm of leasing a car. Um, it seems to be a very normal thing in my culture and how I was raised. And Surprisingly, there are many people out there that are very against it and feel like it's wasteful or unstable. Their worldview around money and responsibility shape how they judge the choice that I made. Even though for me, I did a lot of research and it was the best choice for me for a lot of reasons. So it was just kind of surprising to me because again, how I was raised and my parents owning businesses, it was just very normal to lease cars. A best practice for communicating across cultures is to start with curiosity instead of assumptions. I think if we're always curious to learn and understand, we're going to get a lot further. In the article, the anthropologist assumed the Teve would interpret Hamlet the way that she did. Their questions showed her how different their worldview was. Maybe if she would have asked more questions up front, she might have understood their perspective sooner. And again, just being curious helps us to avoid misunderstanding and shows respect for people's culture. I've had several moments of cultural misunderstanding in my life too. More so, the older I get, working in healthcare, I work with a lot of different cultures and people's that their feelings around death is a lot different than how I was raised. Just depending on the situation. Um, The biggest lesson that I took from the article is that worldview quietly shapes everything, how we interpret stories, how we judge behavior, even what we think is just normal common sense. Intercultural communication starts when we recognize that our perspective isn't the only one that makes sense. I think once you understand that, you communicate with a lot more patience and respect. And again, just that curiosity is helpful.